Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Suzanne Dibble here, data protection law expert, coming to you raw and uncut. And tonight I'm talking to you about data processors and data processors' liability for sub-processors. Okay, so might not apply to all of you, but for those of you that it does apply to, it's an important area that I've not picked up before in any of my videos or trainings. And it just occurred to me today because I'm finalising the briefer processor agreement, and I put lots of notes in there, so hopefully it'll be a lot more self-explanatory and easier to complete. So hope you like that. But if you are a processor and you're using a sub-processor, then there's a number of issues around that. Now, what might be an example of a processor using a sub-processor? Well, my accountant, who's a very nice chap, he looks after my payroll, but he outsources that to a payroll company. Okay, so my accountant is my processor and the payroll provider is the sub-processor. Okay, so that's just an example as to how you would have a processor and a sub-processor. There are lots of other examples. That's just the one that I'm using there. So first thing to note is that there is restrictions on data processors engaging sub-processors. Excuse me, I've got a really sore throat tonight. Without the, I'm quoting from the GDPR here, without the prior specific or general written authorization of the data controller. Okay, now in my view, it's better if you've got specific authorization and the processor agreement is drafted on that basis. Ideally, you want to know who are the sub-processors and know as much about them as you can. But if you give a general written authorization to the data processor to say yes, you know, you might say as long as they meet these conditions, you can appoint a sub-processor. Well, in that case, the data processor must inform the data controller, i.e. you, of any changes. Well, I say you, that's on the basis that you're not a data processor in this instance. But you understand, I'm sure, if you've watched any of my trainings, you know the data controller is the person that controls the personal data relating to the data subject. The processor is the person that processes that personal data under the instruction of the controller. Okay, so the controller has to give this specific or general written authorization in order for the processor to appoint a sub-processor. But if it's a general authorization, then the data processor's got to inform the data controller of any changes to sub-processors and give the data controller the opportunity to object to those changes. Okay, now that is included in the data processor agreement, so you don't need to remember that, but I'm just flagging that. Now, there's also a number of requirements in the GDPR that govern the relationship between the processor and the sub-processor. And what the main things are that the data processor has to enter into a contract that is the same as between the data controller and the data processor. Okay, so you're kind of passing on that contractual protection down the chain to the sub-processor. And that you also have to, the data processor has to ensure that the sub-processor does not process personal data except on instructions from the controller. Okay, so it's not from instructions from the processor, it's from the controller. Okay, so the processor can't just dream up things to do with the data subject's data unless the data controller has authorised that. So it goes without saying that in my example of my accountant and my payroll provider, my accountant couldn't just say to the payroll provider, this is what needs processing this month and make up some figures, for example. They couldn't do that. Even if they were trying to help me out, maybe I had been a bit slack on getting back to them in the required time frame to confirm the monthly salaries for that month, the accountant couldn't say, oh, well, the salaries have all been the same for the last 9 months. I'll confirm to the sub-processor that it's going to be the same for the 10th month. They couldn't do that. Okay, so the sub-processor's got to be able to process personal data only on instruction from the data controller. Now, this is the key bit for data processors out there. The data processor remains fully liable to the data controller for the performance of the sub-processor's obligations. Okay, so if your sub-processor doesn't perform on the contract, or there is in some way a data breach that needs remedying, or whatever it might be, the data processor is fully liable to the data controller. So it's really important to make sure that as a processor you use sub-processors that are GDPR compliant, that are that have all the appropriate protections and measures in place. And it's really important that as a processor you do due diligence on your sub-processors, and what might that look like. Let me find my notes here and I'll tell you what type of due diligence you should be doing. So, okay, so right, here's what you should be thinking about. So looking at and asking questions about what measures they've got in place for guarding against unauthorised or unlawful processing of personal data and against any accidental loss, destruction or damage. Asking them about what technical and organisational security procedures they have in place to secure the personal data. What processes they have for destroying and archiving personal data. Ask them about their policies, procedures, internal controls and training manuals, to assess the sub-process capability to recognise and manage changing data security risks, to conduct appropriate training and oversight of employees, and to meet their contractual requirements under the GDPR. So you should do that initially before you actually appoint them as a sub-processor, but then keep it under review. So conduct follow-up audits and reviews to make sure that they are actually complying with their contractual obligations, because if they're not, then you are liable for that. And also you should be keeping records of categories of data that the sub-processor processes in a form that you could provide to the supervisory authorities if they requested those from you. So with GDPR, I think it's going to bring into focus the chains of contracts where personal data is being processed, and it could be that there's sub-processor upon sub-processor upon sub-processor. It doesn't mean that there's just one, and I think we need to think. Obviously, if you've got a very simple business, don't worry, none of this applies to you. If you're not transferring your data to anybody, you don't need to worry about this. But for those of us that do have more complex businesses, then we really need to think about that contractual chain and how that data is secured all the way through that chain in the light of the obligations in GDPR and the associated liability. So there you go, a video that I think is important. It's not going to be relevant to everybody, but if you are a processor of any type, then it's really important to consider all of that when you are working with sub-processors. If you haven't already, do, and I hope that you all are now taking that. We've got, I know the ICO said that the 25th of May isn't a deadline, but we may as well work towards that, hadn't we, to in our efforts to be compliant. So I hope that those of you who are processors, you have at least started that data inventory, looked at, what is your own personal data that you're the controller of, but what personal data are you processing as a processor, and then looking at the chain downwards from you, and looking at that flow of contractual obligation and liability. Right, that is all. Do go and check out the new processor agreement. For those of you who are processors, I am going to do another, in fact, I said I was going to do another version of it from the processor's point of view. Okay, what I've done is the new processor agreement that I've just put up in the membership site, is it has bits that are highlighted that you can take out that aren't strictly mandatory according to GDPR. So if you're a processor and you look through those and you think, oh, okay, well that's not to my favour and it's not mandatory, then you can choose to remove that clause. Okay, so that's what I've done for you guys. What else do I need to say about processors? No, I think that is it. Any questions, let me know. But otherwise, want to do that for you processors. I know 90% of the questions we get in the group are about marketing, and I say the same things over and over again. But I know how important it is to you to get this right, and I know how much conflicting information there is out there. That's why I'm going to be doing a 1.5 hour webinar, I think on this Thursday lunchtime, and I'll post details about that soon, so we can get all of that on the table and cleared up to the best that we can. Bearing in mind that there isn't guidance on every single thing, and there are quite a few grey areas, but we'll do our best. Okay, that's it for now. I'll see you soon.